afternoon. So today's topic is the environmental factors that play a role in the development of Parkinson's disease. And just to start off, I like to point out that everything that determines who you are, what you do, are, the kind of occupation we're involved in, as well as how well we fit into various, parts of the world. It's all determined by your genetics, what you've inherited from your family line, and where you were raised, your environment. And that's what we're going to focus on, the environmental issues that will determine whether you develop Parkinson's disease. Now, for the genetics, it's been a hot era in the last 15, 20 years of genetics research. So now we know that genetics, our inheritance, plays a very significant role in determining what our health will be. The risk of developing Parkinson's disease is increased if you have a family history of Parkinson's disease. The risk is doubled if you have a first-degree family member with Parkinson's disease. But even still, if you look at the numbers, it sounds like horrible. I have double the risk of anybody else if I have a family history. But the risk of anybody in the United States of developing Parkinson's disease by the age of 70 is 1 in 100. It's called the 1% risk of developing the illness, regardless of your background, regardless of anything. It's just the epidemiology of the disorder. In other words, the frequency of the illness is 1 in 100 of people in their 70s. So if you have a family history, it's going to be double that risk. It'll be 2 in 100. So when you look at it, being an optimist, I see the glass being half filled rather than half empty, right? So to think of it this way, you have double the risk that means you have a 2% likelihood, 2 out of 100. It's a pretty good chance you won't develop illness. You have 98 out of 100 likelihood that you will not develop the illness, even with a family history. So that's just to point out how little the role of genetic factors plays in the development of sporadic Parkinson's disease. It's mostly environment. And in reality, that family history is an underestimate of the role of genetics, because there are some disorders in which a genetic mutation will invariably result in the disease. And that's, for example, Huntington's disease, which I like to consider as a cousin of Parkinson's disease. It's a disorder that involves the same brain regions that are involved in Parkinson's disease, but it is much more severe, and it's always, you can't acquire it by environment. It's always genetic, Huntington's. Whereas Parkinson's disease, 98% of the people never have a family history of Parkinson's disease. But there are genetic factors that will make you more vulnerable to certain environmental factors. So genetics is still a very critical component in determining whether you get the illness or not. So like everything, like intelligence, height, body weight, is determined by the interaction of your inheritance, which is genetically determined. You get through the DNA that's passed on generation after generation, in the environment. So if you're born the children of 2 professors, one is an MIT professor of mathematics, and your mother is a classic scholar, but you were raised in impoverished conditions where you were malnourished, that's a weird contrast, but weirder things happen. And when there's upheaval in the world, for example, in Germany during World War II, well, some of these kids were taken from their family. They had a tremendous genetic endowment, but they were put in concentration camps, were malnourished, didn't grow up normally, didn't have normal size, body weight, and they didn't get to develop their intellects. So that's how critical environmental factors are. And now that's an extreme. The reality is there are subtle variations. So what I'm going to talk about is what are the environmental factors that will increase your risk of Parkinson's disease. It's kind of late to worry about it now, for this audience. But it's something that I talk to amongst my medical students, and is to be aware that the early environmental exposures are critical. So one of the big insights that the illness could be caused by environmental factors came from the realm of pharmacology and toxicology. So for the longest time, no one knew what the cause of illness was. James Parkinson himself thought it was due to tremendous emotional stresses, or perhaps trauma. In fact, trauma to the brain increases the risk, especially if you have a severe trauma to the brain where you lose consciousness, can increase the risk of Parkinson's disease. This is based on epidemiological studies where they give questionnaires to people to recall having had a serious head injury, and they'll ask the same questions of those who have Parkinson's disease versus those who don't. And it's very likely, it's much more likely that a person with Parkinson's disease has had prior head trauma. So that's how epidemiology works. There's a lot of flaws. There are associations. So there is an association between head trauma and developing Parkinson's disease. But it's not a cause and effect. Just because you've had head traumas or multiple head traumas doesn't mean you will develop Parkinson's disease. So that's one of the early clues. Indeed, trauma is one of those environmental factors that increases the risk of Parkinson's disease, head trauma, but doesn't cause it. This was known since the 19th century. We've known that trauma can increase the risk, but it's not a strong association. There's something called recall bias. If you ask someone who has a condition like Parkinson's disease, they're more likely to remember events that happened when they were younger, because they're asking themselves, what could have caused this illness? No one in my family has it, and they're more likely to recall incidents in their adolescence. Oh yeah, I played football and I had 5 concussions, and maybe that's why I developed Parkinson's. So that's the problem with epidemiological studies that are based on recall of people's past history. The same thing has gone on with diet. They've done epidemiology, and that's a very significant environmental factor. That's why we feed you here all the time, because keep you healthy. But if you don't eat the right kinds of foods, or you eat certain patterns, a certain diet, your risk of developing Parkinson's disease is greater or less. So I talked about this already, the role of diet in Parkinson's disease. So individuals who have high-fat diets are more likely, people in Northern, Western Europe and the United States are more likely to have Parkinson's disease than people who have a vegetarian or low-fat, low-animal product diet. So that's one of the things. People who eat nuts, fruits, and vegetables have a lower risk of developing Parkinson's disease. So that's an important environmental factor, but you have to start that really early on. You don't start that diet when you're 65. It's already kind of late because the illness is insidious. Begins probably at the age of 40 when we begin to lose the amount of dopamine that's being produced in the brain. So it's something that you have to start early in life. So tell your grandchildren and children to eat their greens. Things that will decrease the risk also of Parkinson's disease are cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, cauliflower, etc. Things that will decrease the risk based on epidemiology are, paradoxically, a glass of beer a day, but it's only in men. This is an epidemiological study that was done. If you have a glass of beer a day, the risk of developing Parkinson's disease is less, but not for women. And wine or cocktails doesn't count. That doesn't decrease the risk. Also, smoking cigarettes decreases the risk of Parkinson's disease, which is ironic, but it makes sense when you think of the reaction to smoking. Increases perhaps your ability to deal with oxidative stress. But that's always puzzled me. People who drink X number of cups of coffee and have done that for decades or have a lesser risk of developing Parkinson's disease. So things to think about: have a glass of beer every day. I'm talking about you should have started this a long time ago. Have a couple of cups of coffee a day. Smoke 1 or 2 cigarettes a day. I think that's counterproductive because that increases the risk of a whole bunch of other conditions like cardiac disease, lung cancer, etc. But this is all based on epidemiology. Now I'm going to get into really hard data. Epidemiology provides clues as to what could be the causes or risk factors for Parkinson's disease. So what is some hard data? Well, the first real evidence that Parkinson's disease could be caused by environmental chemical came in around 1983. This is a long time after Parkinson's disease was first described. But it came with this small epidemic. It wasn't a true widespread epidemic, but it was localized to the San Francisco Bay Area in 1983, where hundreds of individuals would show up in the emergency rooms with Parkinsonism. They'd be shuffling their feet, drooling, cogwheel rigidity, tremor. The thing that was unusual about them, it came on pretty quickly, and they were IV drug abusers. They were young people. They were 20s to 30s. And the common element was that they were intravenous injectors, self-administering heroin, or things that they thought were like heroin. And so a guy named William Langston, who was working at Stanford University at the time, and noticed he's the first to report this increased frequency of Parkinsonism in young people, and was able to get a hold of some of the drugs that they were buying in the black market. And the drugs were known, the drug that they were using was known as China White. It was an underground, made in someone's underground kitchen lab, and it was contaminated. It was supposedly a Demerol analog, and Demerol is a synthetic opiate drug used for pain management. So it's an opiate basically, and it produces the same problems as heroin. It can, people get physically dependent, and it does all the things that morphine and heroin would do, Demerol, but they had got this stuff called China White, and after X number of injections of it, they developed in a short period of time Parkinsonism. And he was able to identify within the drug they were using a contaminant called MPTP. MPTP is an acronym for a long chemical name, but I like to say it because I did a lot of work with it. So it's called methylphenyl tetrahydropyridine. It has a poetic ring to it, but it's a horrible, nasty toxin. But it revolutionized our approach to the study of environmental factors that can cause Parkinson's disease. In fact, if it wasn't for MPTP and that little epidemic in 1983, I wouldn't have gone into the study of Parkinson's disease. Why I got involved in it, I was a neurology resident at the time, had absolutely no interest in Parkinson's disease or any movement disorder other than the usual kind of required understanding of these disorders. And in fact, I thought I might even focus in stroke disorders because of my mentor, who was a fantastic teacher. But I read the papers, and I was a resident, that Langston published, and he identified the chemical structure, and showed that if you injected this into mice or monkeys, you could reproduce Parkinson's disease in an animal. And it was a permanent disorder, because we already knew from the 1950s that certain medications, the major tranquilizers or antipsychotic drugs, could produce a transient Parkinsonism, and we still see that all the time now. Certain major tranquilizers, I'm talking about antipsychotic drugs, they're not to be confused with minor tranquilizers like Valium, Librium, Ativan. Those don't cause Parkinson's disease or Parkinsonism. But the major tranquilizers that can calm very aggressive animals, that treat schizophrenic, paranoia, delusions, and aggressive behaviors, they can produce Parkinsonism as a side effect because they happen to block dopamine in the nigrostriatal system. So it mimics Parkinson's disease, and that dopamine in the nigrostriatal function is not working like it should. So people become slow, rigid, tremulous. You take away the drug, and their illness goes away. Of course, they become schizophrenic again. So we knew that there are drugs that home in on dopamine receptors and can mimic Parkinson's disease. We call it Parkinsonism. a syndrome that mimics Parkinson's disease. It's called Parkinson's syndrome or Parkinsonism. But this drug from 1983, MPTP, didn't mimic it. It actually reproduced the illness. It zoomed in on dopamine neurons and destroyed them. There was not enough dopamine. And these young IV drug abusers with MPTP-induced Parkinsonism had a very good response to levodopa. They got better if you gave them levodopa and replaced dopamine. And the interesting thing, they were a lot like the young onset Parkinson's disease patients that we have now, the cause of which we don't know, the run-of-the-mill young onset Parkinson's disease. They developed dyskinesias really early on, and so did these IV drug abusers who had developed MPTP-induced Parkinsonism. They developed dyskinesias with chorea, dystonia, after just a short period of time of using levodopa. Most of my patients who develop the disease at the age of 60 will develop levodopa-induced dyskinesias 3 to 5 years after using high doses of levodopa, whereas a young onset person can develop it within 6 months of using levodopa. That's why people like Muhammad Ali and Michael J. Fox, who had young onset PD, developed really early on dystonias in response to levodopa. That's why they didn't like to take those drugs and used other approaches. So the MPTP story became a major focus for me because I had done my PhD work on the mechanism of action of opiates in the brain that led to drug dependence and withdrawal syndrome. So in the 1970s, when I did my PhD work, it was a big era of exploring the brain's own opiate receptors and the brain's own opium. I mean, you've heard of endorphins and enkephalins. Well, the reason morphine and opiates work is that we have receptors for them in the brain. They're called the endogenous opioid system. And that was the discovery of the endogenous opiate system occurred when I was doing my PhD work, and I was really fascinated by studying that system and studying how it's modified by exogenous drugs like morphine to result in physical dependence. So one of the important things that we knew is that opiates and that the mesolimbic dopamine system, remember there's 2 dopamine systems, roughly speaking. I always talk about this because if you block the mesolimbic dopamine system, you get rid of schizophrenia, psychosis, hallucinations. If you block the nigrostriatal dopamine system, the motor dopamine system, you develop Parkinsonism. If you treat with dopamine replacement and you activate the nigrostriatal system, you improve movement and maybe get too much movement. If you treat with drugs that stimulate dopamine system in the mesolimbic emotional system, you get crazy thoughts, you get schizophrenia, you have hallucinations. So then now you can understand why some people develop psychosis, hallucinations, visual hallucinations when they take levodopa or drugs, because it's activating the emotional dopamine part, the mesolimbic dopamine. So let me get back. So I had been very intrigued how opiates, why they're so reinforcing, why people want to repeat the experience over and over, is because it released dopamine in the mesolimbic system. The mesolimbic dopamine system is the chemistry of reward, of well-being. If you were to block mesolimbic dopamine, you cannot experience pleasure. You'd be anhedonic. Drugs and anything that makes you feel good, from sex to having a good meal after you're satisfied, releases dopamine in the mesolimbic dopamine system. So that's what my background was. I had studied that system, how opiates interact with the mesolimbic dopamine system, and I was studying how morphine, that was radiolabeled, zoomed in on the mesolimbic dopamine system. This was in the late 70s. Then I went to medical school, did neurology training, and then this MPTP story of IV drug abusers came out. So of course, I completely changed direction of my research and what I plan to do with my career. So I then decided I would focus on environmental chemicals that look like MPTP that could cause Parkinson's disease. The goal was to find what is the key chemical factor that causes Parkinson's disease. That report in 1983 stimulated a big search by all over for chemicals in the environment that can cause Parkinson's disease. Now, many of you already have heard this story, but I'm telling it from my personal perspective because this story of I was a pharmacologist, toxicologist, who was very interested in drug dependence and what makes people feel good when they use drugs. And why do they get physically dependent? And then all of a sudden I'm involved in Parkinson's disease. So since I knew I didn't know enough about Parkinson's disease, I knew a lot about the chemistry and the cells and the brain structures. I went to the University of Miami and did a fellowship focused only on Parkinson's disease at the National Parkinson Foundation. And my relationship with the National Parkinson Foundation that led to my interaction with Larry Hofheimer, who worked with them, and then he started the foundation here, and I continue to work with him. So that's tying all the loose ends together. So what I decided to do is search and screen for environmental toxicants, environmental chemicals that could reproduce Parkinson's disease. So I developed a cell culture system for screening hundreds of chemicals. Now, I didn't take chemicals at random. I had a key chemical, MPTP. I knew what its structure was like. So I looked at other chemicals that were similar to it, and guess what? One of them is known as paraquat. MPTP and paraquat are very similar in structure. You don't know what paraquat is, but you should. Paraquat is an herbicide. It was sprayed in huge amounts in the national forest by the DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency, to destroy the marijuana crops that the hippies had planted in the national forest in California. And paraquat destroys plants, but imagine these hippies in California harvesting their cannabis and smoking it. They were exposed to paraquat as well. So I always predicted, so anyway, I tested paraquat. Yes, paraquat is very toxic to dopamine neurons, just like MPTP. The difference is that paraquat doesn't get into the brain very easily, so it's very unlikely that all that cannabis smoked by the hippies contaminated by DEA sprayed paraquat caused the illness. And I don't see an upturn in the frequency of Parkinson's disease in ex-hippies. They're matured and now are running the government. Well, I'm just joking there. Who's really running the government? I always fall into the trap of bringing in politics, but I won't mention any names. So I ended up getting a grant from the Department of Defense to look at environmental toxicants, because I found a few others that were really interesting. One is a fungal toxicant produced by certain fungi. And people have heard about this. We in Florida are very aware of this, of fungi growing in the air conditioning system. Then you can get a sick building syndrome. You work in these old buildings that had the air conditioning system for 30 years, and it's just overgrown with mold, or mold growing through leaks behind the wall. And people get very sick. And so I never was able to show that the sick building syndrome can lead to an increased frequency of Parkinson's disease, but we did look at toxicants produced by several of these fungi. One is called rubrotoxin, the other is called ochratoxin. And we found that ochratoxin destroyed, injected into mice, first of all, it destroyed dopamine neurons when I added the ochratoxin to my cell cultures. And the cell cultures have dopamine neurons that we grow. They're prepared from mouse fetal midbrain, so you get a nice brain cell culture that they make dopamine, and you can test. That's how I tested all these chemicals to see if they destroy these neurons and at what dose. So having found that that was destructive of dopamine neurons, we gave it to mice, and sure enough, the mice developed Parkinsonism. But it was never permanent. Then we looked at what's going on. What it did was destroy the terminals of the dopamine neurons, so they depleted dopamine, but it never really killed the cell bodies. So after some time, the animals would re-sprout their dopamine terminals and get normal again. So it wasn't really what I thought would be the cause of Parkinson's disease, these toxicants. It didn't really replicate what MPTP had done in animals. So there was another toxicant that I should mention was toxic that others have found is called rotenone. And the other was, there's one other. But the thing that these have in common, these toxicants that destroy dopamine neurons, is that they poison the bioenergetic warehouse, or the bioenergetic system of cells called mitochondria. Every cell has a furnace, so to speak, where fuel is combined with oxygen to generate heat and chemical bonds. That's essential for life. If you poison mitochondria, you die. So the way that MPTP was shown to work very early on was that it's converted to a chemical called MPP that to the brain looks like dopamine. So dopamine neurons take it up, and then in dopamine neurons it accumulates in the mitochondria and poisons them. So there's a lot of oxidative stress, not enough energy being made, and a lot of oxyradicals. So we knew that. The insight provided by MPTP studies into the underlying pathogenesis of PD was amazing. It led people to say, well, maybe Parkinson's disease is related to a disorder of bioenergetics, that Parkinson's disease patients develop a problem with mitochondria because MPTP does it. Maybe there's an environmental factor or something wrong in patients' brains that they have a problem with mitochondrial function. And indeed, they looked at brain tissue from patients with Parkinson's disease after they had died. They looked at muscle, and there was a bioenergetic compromise. The mitochondria were not functioning normally. There was a complex 1 problem. Complex 1 is one of the steps in mitochondrial function that is compromised that leads to the demise of the neurons. And so that led to very big studies that turned out to be disappointing. So now we know, based on environmental factors that can cause Parkinsonism, that they tend to have a common element where they poison the bioenergetic system of dopamine neurons. So the natural thing is, how can we treat that or prevent? So that led to the big studies of selegiline and vitamin E at big doses. Selegiline turned out to be Deprenyl brand name. And we gave doses of this in the long run for in huge numbers of patients to see if we could delay the disease or slow the progression of disease. And unfortunately, they didn't. So we realized that even though there is a bioenergetic compromise, the treatments that we had, including mitochondrial enhancers or mitochondrial cocktails, had no impact on the progression of the illness. So we were disappointed about that. But I want to, because I want to throw, I went with the epidemiology just to point out a few things. I forgot one critical bit of epidemiology that people knew, that the risk of Parkinson's disease based on epidemiological studies is increased if you grew up drinking well water for the first 30 years of your life, right? So that was another hint. This was before the MPTP story. So we knew that something in water, so people looked at heavy metals that are found in waters. And we also had a bit of really interesting information that came out of Chile, and actually came from England originally. Soon after James Parkinson described Parkinson's paralysis agitans, there's a guy named Cooper who described a very similar syndrome, but with a psychiatric element, known as manganese toxicity and manganese madness. And people who were the ore crushers, manganese ore crushers in England, they were manganese miners and they crush it, they would develop a Parkinson's syndrome, but with more dystonia and sometimes psychiatric problems. So that was the first description of a heavy metal causing what looked a little like Parkinson's disease, but people thought of it as a separate condition called manganese poisoning. And then there was out of Chile, the manganese miners in Chile, in South America, developed locura manganesa, which is manganese madness. And it was found that if they got out of that environment, their psychiatric condition would improve. But then they went on to develop progressive Parkinsonism, and it looked identical to Parkinson's disease. So we knew that. And then I got involved because of my history of working with environmental toxicants that can cause Parkinsonism. I started looking at manganese in cell culture. Indeed, manganese added to our dopamine neurons, especially with neuromelanin, which dopamine neurons contain, it is very toxic to dopamine neurons. But by itself, it wasn't that interesting. What was most interesting was that welders were developing Parkinsonism at a much higher rate than people who that weren't welders, age-matched other occupations. And there was a huge study of hundreds of welders, and indeed, they have a higher risk of developing Parkinson's disease. And the difference in their Parkinson's disease symptoms is they tend to have a lot more dystonia. Almost like the young Parkinson patients present with dystonia as the first sign of cramping. Dystonia means abnormal posturing due to sustained contraction of muscle. It's like a cramp. So a person with young onset PD will notice that their big toe goes up or their foot turns in. That could be the first sign. Or as they walk, their hand may go like this, twist and turn. And manganese-induced Parkinsonism, that is very similar too. And the controversy is whether they get better on dopamine or not. And that's still not 100% clear, but the people, many patients who had manganese-induced Parkinsonism did recover function with dopamine replacement. Some of them didn't. So that's another bit of environmental factors. So drinking well water, manganese poisoning can increase the risk of Parkinson's disease for sure. And one other bit of information. I think I'm just going to summarize it here, that there's no doubt that environmental factors play a very critical role in development of the illness. And it's not just one that we've identified. There are pesticides and herbicides. By the way, epidemiologically, we know that people who apply pesticides, like that work for Terminex or the other pesticide companies, they have higher risk of developing the illness. People who work with heavy metals, not just manganese mining, but coal smelting, in the steel industry, where these metals are produced, they have a higher risk of developing Parkinson's disease. Battery workers, people who work in battery factories, have a higher risk of developing Parkinson's disease. So there are many occupations that increase your risk of developing Parkinson's disease, and it relates to the environmental factors that you're exposed to. So it could be heavy metals, it could be pesticides and herbicides. And the herbicides were used excessively, is all I can say. We used to, Then one of the other, when I went to Miami to study environmental toxicants, I said, what better way? They had an incredibly good brain bank. People would donate their brains to the National Parkinson Foundation Brain Bank. So I got a small grant to look at 18 different organochlorine pesticides. Those are the ones that are like DDT that we knew we could measure because they're very fat soluble. So if you were exposed to them when you were in your 30s, it would still be there. It can't be biodegraded, it stays in the fat tissue. So the brain has a lot of fatty tissue. All the insulation is just like the plastic around wires. Well, the insulation is myelin, is very fatty to allow the electrical activity to conduct rapidly. So you have insulation, and in that insulation you have a fatty material, and that contains a lot of fat-soluble pesticides like DDT. So I had a small grant to look at levels of 18 different organochlorine pesticides. DDT is an example of one of them, but included many others. Another is dieldrin, which was banned in 1970. Like all of these were banned because they were affecting wildlife. The hawks and eagles' eggs weren't forming properly because of these pesticides, so they were banned. Unfortunately, other countries haven't banned them, and we import their grapes, for example. And, so I always look to see where the fruit I eat came from, because these pesticides are not good for us to ingest. So give you the results of that paper. DDT, we took brains from Parkinson's disease patients, age-matched controls, people that were of the same age and sex but didn't have Parkinson's disease, and people who had Alzheimer's disease in life, because we had access to Alzheimer's brain, Parkinson's brain, and normal age-matched controls. And every brain we looked at had high levels of DDT in the caudate putamen, where dopamine terminals are high. So there was no relation between DDT, but the one that was significantly elevated, and was confirmed by others in subsequent studies, was dieldrin, which was markedly elevated in the striatum. of patients with Parkinson's disease, but not in Alzheimer's, not in the controls. And we published that paper. And then because of that paper, I was given that award, that grant to study other environmental toxins, so I expanded it to ochre tox, and I did dieldrin studies in cell culture and in mice, and so forth. But the reason that's quite interesting is that I said, aha, dieldrin has got to be the one, because it stays in your body for life. It's not biodegradable, very little. It is biodegradable, but once it's in the fat, it's going to be there. It doesn't, unless till the fat is recycled and it's released, and then it can be metabolized. But it turns out that there's a variation in the metabolism of every chemical we're exposed to. That's another genetically determined factor. In fact, if you think of the immune system as a modifiable defense system against viruses and bacteria, we have what is called the cytochrome P450 system in the liver. That is the defense against chemical agents. In fact, all the drugs we take in are metabolized by the liver to help get rid of it. That's why every drug you take has a shortened half-life. It's metabolized by enzymes that are genetically determined because we inherit our variations of these enzymes. For example, some people don't inherit the ability to break down alcohol in certain, and so these people can't tolerate alcohol. They get terrible headaches, they get drunk with one hit. So Asians are more likely to not have a good capacity to break down alcohol, whereas Westerners, especially my Irish wife, she can drink incredible amount of hard liquor, and she's just bright as can be. I have just this much and I'm on the ground. So anyway, that's an example of genetically determined, but it's also affected by your environment, because if you start at a young age to drink alcohol, you can upregulate certain enzymes that will break it down. You become tolerant to it. That's how it is with your genetically determined variations, your ability to break down chemicals that we're all exposed to, including the dangerous ones. We can adapt, we can improve our ability to, by repetitive dosing. It's what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. This is what Nietzsche said. Small doses of certain toxins result in an upregulation of the enzymes needed to break down the toxin. So the next time you're exposed to it, you can deal with it, just like an immune system. In fact, the whole cytochrome P450 system that is genetically determined and modifiable by experience is very, very important in determining whether people will develop Parkinson's disease when they are exposed to dieldrin. So there was, because of the papers I published on this area, I got a letter from a physician in Clarksville, Mississippi, which is a cotton growing region. And he said, all of these people in this small town, he says, it's amazing what the proportion of Parkinson's disease. There's a little pocket. And he's pretty convinced that these rural people there, some of them were, they were the farmers, but there was also the people, the laborers from that town. And I forget the frequency, but it was much higher than in the general population. So he agreed to send me blood samples from patients who had Parkinson's disease, who worked all their lives in the cotton industry in Clarksville, versus those that never, ever, they had the gas station or whatever, that didn't have Parkinson's disease and weren't exposed to the same, daily grind of cotton farming. And what was really interesting to me was every one of those blood samples had high levels of dieldrin. But unfortunately, they were no different. There were people that didn't have Parkinson's disease that had really high levels, and people that had the illness that had high levels. So the only thing I could conclude from that is that those that didn't have the disease had a better capacity in the brain's breakdown mechanism, or maybe the liver, to break it down so it wasn't toxic and could maybe clear it better. So that's going to summarize it the way I began. So clearly, genetics is key, and that most of the genetic risk factors have to do with how you metabolize environmental toxins. I think after all, this is really a sporadic illness. The majority of the cases of Parkinson's disease we see have no known genetic determinant that we know of. And therefore it must be environmental. Because not everyone develops it, but there are certain environmental risks. And it's probably the chemicals that we accumulate throughout our life through our diet, through where we live, etc. The final bit of exposure that we can't forget is carbon monoxide poisoning. And it'd been known for a long time that if you were exposed, a furnace problem, an attempted suicide, getting the car exhaust into your house, because these people that survive the poisoning, when they recover, a certain proportion of them develop a rigid akinetic syndrome that looks just like Parkinson's disease, but without the tremor. They have the small steps, rigidity, masked face, and they don't have a deficiency of dopamine. And dopamine replacement doesn't work. But what the carbon monoxide poisoning did was destroy one of the way stations of dopamine action. They called the globus pallidus. So the carbon monoxide destroys a pathway through which dopamine normally works. It's, think of it this way. The automatic execution of movement requires dopamine being released onto a downstream set of neurons that releases its transmitter to another, and there's these incredible networks of neural activity that are triggered by dopamine. But you can also develop Parkinsonism by interfering with the downstream way station of dopamine action. That's what the carbon monoxide will do. So we will see rigid akinetic Parkinsonism due to carbon monoxide poisoning. Those are not that common. There was a big, in the 1920s, I wrote a review on carbon monoxide poisoning and Parkinson's disease years ago. And there used to be a lot more of it in the days when people weren't as aware of it. And New York City had a big problem with carbon monoxide poisoning. And it wasn't like cause a lot of death so much as a lot of neurological problems. And it can also end up causing spasticity and some cognitive issues. But mostly it's a movement disorder caused by carbon monoxide poisoning. Finally, the other toxicant that can increase the risk of Parkinson's disease is high-dose methamphetamine. And that was, when I was doing my PhD work, there was a colleague that worked for the same mentor who was doing high-dose amphetamine administration to rhesus monkeys. And if he gave very frequent high doses of amphetamine, the animals would develop Parkinsonism because that destroyed dopamine terminals. And it took really high doses in chronic use. So there's been my mentor, who later went on to become the head of National Institute of Drug Abuse, and I was at the University of Miami. He had a small meeting in Washington where we were thinking of doing a study of amphetamine users in the United States to see if they had a higher risk of Parkinson's disease. And the population he was going to study were the long-distance truck drivers who tend to use a lot of amphetamine so that they don't fall asleep at the wheel. But that study never got off the ground. But I think that's another environmental kind of agent that can increase the risk of Parkinson's disease. And then that leads to the legitimate use of psychomotor stimulants by prescription for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, that more and more kids are given this to allow them to focus and concentrate because they can't focus and they're restless. But some of these kids go on to continue to take this I have adults who've been taking this forever and that I know, and I worry about them developing Parkinson's disease. Will it increase the risk? We don't know. So I'm going to end it here. I'll take a few questions and yes.
I have one. You talked about trauma to the brain. Is there any connection at all with Parkinson's and meningiomas?
No.
Okay.
Did the rhesus monkeys recover?
From what?
You said the dopamine receptors are what was damaged, and in the other animal,
Well, if I gave them MPTP, it destroyed the dopamine neurons and the dopamine terminals, so that they don't recover generally. It's a dose depending. If you just give a low dose of MPTP, you just destroy the terminals. You give a higher dose, you destroy terminals in the cell bodies. Once you destroy the cell bodies, there's not much recovery at all. If you destroy the terminals, there is a resprouting. So, but that's with MPTP, which is the toxin that is most faithful in reproducing the pathology and symptoms of Parkinson's disease. The others are not as faithful in reproducing the symptoms.
As for taking dopamine, I was misdiagnosed at age 37. I'm now 50. How much dopamine should one person take in order to,
Well, you didn't take dopamine, you either took levodopa, that is the natural precursor.
carbidopa, levodopa?
Yeah, so that you're taking a drug that will result in higher levels of dopamine. It's never been shown to be toxic. So, in fact, there are many healthy people that use levodopa, carbidopa for bodybuilding or for feelings of well-being, and they take much higher doses even. But all the evidence that we have in given levodopa, carbidopa to Parkinson disease animals or normal animals is never shown to destroy dopaminergic neurons or be toxic. So the only bad thing is that you didn't know what you had, so you have a tremor, and they don't know what it is still, probably. Essential tremor, maybe. But we're not here to discuss individual cases anyway. But in general, you can take dopamine from the age of 20 till you're 70. Very, very light on dopamine replacement, I should say. You won't have a problem. The biggest problem in taking those drugs is you develop side effects from the drugs themselves, like lightheadedness, when you stand up, that kind of thing, or obsessive behaviors like compulsive gambling, hypersexuality. That all can happen if you take too much dopamine replacement. You can, if you have the right predisposition, trigger free associations and hallucinations, just like any psychomotor stimulant. So anyway, I don't want to go on. Just to say that even they misdiagnosed you and they gave you levodopa, carbidopa, that was a tragedy. They spent all that time taking the wrong drug that didn't help you. What I do, if it doesn't help the patient, I don't give it anymore. That's the thing. You probably didn't go to the doctor anymore, or you didn't go to the right doctor. One more question, and then I have to get ready. That's it. Good. Oh, one more here.
My friend Mal and I just discovered that we've also worked with some kind of cancer resins. And
Those will cause cancer more than any kind of neurodegenerative disease. Those are well known to cause cancer. There's a few famous sculptors who use polymers, and they develop pancreatic cancer, liver cancer the most. No more questions, unless it's relevant to this, because most people just want to hear about their own story.
No, you were mentioning a drug for ADD that may cause Parkinson's.
Yeah. Do you know what's used for ADD? Psychomotor stimulants. Adderall is one. Ritalin
So they
is
all
the other.
good.
Methylphenidate. Yeah. No, I don't know if they will increase the risk for Parkinson's disease, but I worry about it because people take this for all their life, and they really, I'm afraid, shouldn't be doing that.